I'm Lauren Rivers, and this is my review of the Star Justice series by Michael Scott Earle. Now, I originally came across this series when looking for books on Amazon because I tend to have the tendency to pick up a lot of books at a time, which, this series is centered around three major characters, Adam, Eve, and Z. And, Adam is a super soldier were-tiger, which I admit is most of the reason why I started reading the series in the first place, because of the Tiger Man on the cover. The art was actually pretty good. But, as far as when I went into the series itself and got into the meat of it, while it was entertaining, especially, after I'd read the first book, the further along I went in the series, the less it kind of seemed to be my kind of story. And, I'll get into that more later. But, they also have Eve, who is a superpowered vampire space witch, which is basically kind of how they describe her. And later on in the first book, you meet Z, who is a blonde hacker who has some sort of a cable so you can plug into her head in order to hack into just about anything. And, the first 2 or 3 books, I think, are mostly around these three characters. Generally, it's a single plot thread, and, for the most part, the first book is about their escape from the original planet. And unfortunately, at least in my estimation, it just kind of felt like after the first book, most of the other ones just seemed to follow the same pattern. They would find a problem and be sidetracked by something else, which would take most of the book to resolve. But, I'll get into some more of the issues in a little bit. Most of the characters kind of had a lack of a backstory, which, 6 books in, I really don't know much about the characters other than their basic back details. The hacker, you kind of get the feeling like she's been on this planet for a while, but as far as, doing anything of significance, there really wasn't much. The vampire character, she was pretty much floating in a tube for a couple of centuries, so, there really wasn't a lot of backstory with her. And, Adam, you kind of get an indication of his military history, that he was working for the Yakuza at some point, and, most of his history is just kind of touched on but never really shown, and it doesn't really seem to have a huge impact on his character as far as I could tell. But, 6 books in, I kind of wish that there had been more information to tell me about who these characters are and why they do what they do, because their motivation is simply to help people, which on some level is fantastic, but it felt to me like there was never any justification as to why they were doing this. I mean, people don't just become cops or firemen or nurses just because they feel like it. Their only motivation seemed to be to help people when, given their backgrounds, with Adam being a soldier forced into experiments and, various military missions, Eve being held captive for 200 years, it just felt much more likely like revenge would have been what they would have been after rather than giving a crap about helping anybody else. And, this altruism is never really explained in any of the characters. They just, help people to the point of giving more than would be practical in terms of, like, donating all of their ship's food stores to people who, they want to help, but it just doesn't make sense. You wouldn't give somebody all your money to help them, even if you wanted to. I mean, you would give them something maybe, but you wouldn't just turn over all your supplies. And, a lot of that kind of sticks them in the same scenario where after they've helped someone, they have to go basically get supplies again. And this causes more problems that they have to deal with. I mean, the problem with the cast itself is that a lot of the characters, at least to me, they felt very God-moded. These characters, their abilities are just, depending on what the plot requires, some of them are pretty intense, and sometimes they just aren't there for whatever reason. It's like, Adam can change into a were-tiger, and he pretty much plows through just about any obstacle he comes across. I don't really recall any instance in the first 6 books where he actually can't accomplish whatever it is he's trying to do, usually by brute force. Except, of course, in one particular case where the plot required it, but even then, this character still managed to find a way to do everything that he needed to do without it really slowing him down that much. I mean, Eve's powers are nebulously defined at best. I mean, she's been shown that she can, drain blood, that she can take out 30 guys in with little to no problem, that she can project fire, that she can read minds, all of these different powers, and yet when the plot requires it, a bunch of dudes sneak up on her and just knock her out. And then later on in that same book, or at least maybe it might have been the following book, she ends up freeing herself anyway. The main character, he knows that he's got to go save them, but at the same time he kind of figures, well, you got a hacker, a super-powered vampire chick, and a few other characters. They'll probably be fine. And of course, when he finally does catch up to them, they've already freed themselves. So it just kind of defeats the purpose of his urgency to try and save them, just because, these powers, if they have them, why would they have gotten taken captive in the first place? It kind of is, what I relate a little bit to things like teleportation. I mean, if you can teleport anywhere, sometimes it seems like a good ability, but then you have to answer questions as to, why can't they teleport to this particular plot point? Usually it involves establishing rules as to why these things are the case. Like, you can only teleport a certain range, but, with powers that really aren't well defined, such as in this series, there's really no explanation as to why the mind-reading superpowered vampire couldn't stop a bunch of guys with blow darts. And the characters really don't have any weaknesses that I would particularly define. They've very much, I think what I've said before, God-moded, and the weaknesses that they do have, which really aren't many, never really force the plot in a new direction. Like, for example, Adam has to sleep after he turns into a were-tiger and stays in that form for a while, and if he stays there long enough, eventually it starts to take over, but neither one of these ever forces its way to the forefront. It gets close a couple of times, but he's never forced to sleep when it would be inconvenient. He always manages to hold out just long enough to make it back to his ship until he's fine, even when he clearly comments several times on how tired he is. And, it seems like it would have made it more interesting if he had been forced to sleep and had to wake up somewhere else, rather than the fact that he just holds on a little bit longer. Eve, it's like her powers work until the plot doesn't want them to. And, that just, I don't know, that gets on my nerves after a while. And the plots I found a little bit repetitive, after the first one, which was pretty much an escape dynamic. 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, they all were kind of like, let's go to a place, try to do something. We got sidetracked by something else, and are forced to deal with this something else for the whole entirety of the book. Then finally, when we get back on track, then the same thing happens in the next book, and it really kind of feels like, rather than making any progress, that you're eternally just trying to deal with these interrupts. And while I know that a plot is supposed to basically put things in your path, it kind of feels like, at least to me, that this series doesn't really do a good job of making those feel organic, or at least making you feel like you're making enough progress. It's kind of like you've got a checklist, and rather than checking off a couple of things before you add some more stuff to the list, you're constantly being prevented from checking off any of these things because yet more things keep adding to the list. And that's kind of how it felt to me. I'm also made to think about the particular approaches most of these characters had to the obstacles that they would run into, and I'm reminded of the saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything starts looking like a nail. It seems like the characters, their skills were perfectly designated to whatever problem they happened to be facing. If Eve had to be dealing with any kind of a threat, usually she would be able to read their mind. If Adam needed to get the group through something, he'd have guns and claws and other things to force his way through it. If anything, they ran into a computer problem, of course Z was there to hack it. Basically things like that. Whatever technology they ran into, whatever obstacle they had, there was always somebody that either knew how to use it or was the precise person you would need to fix the problem, and never once were they really forced to work around that. It's like, oh crap, we don't have a hacker. Well, we can't do the thing, so what do we do now? You never really had that. And I mean, you pretty much knew that whichever characters you had, these were the kind of problems you were going to encounter. You would see, countless soldiers when you got Adam around. It's like you're always going to see fights with tons of NPCs that, get their heads exploded into bloody piles, and it's just, it really didn't seem like it made a whole lot of sense in terms of, I guess, overall world building, just because every problem just seemed to be solved the same way depending on which characters you happen to have. And I know that it describes itself as having harem situations, things like that, which in itself I wouldn't mind, but the way that they go about it, it didn't feel organic. It kind of feels like one of those animes where everybody loves the main character for no reason. It's like, sure, Adam's the only guy in town, so to speak, or at least for the first 5 books he is, but it feels like these characters fall in love with him before it's justified, rather than him earning their love and it feeling like it's organic. Not to mention the fact that everybody just seems cool with the whole polyamorous situation without any real development in that direction. There's a little hesitation on Eve and Z's part, particularly early on in the series as they try and figure it out, but it just kind of gives the feeling that anytime a new hot chick shows up, hey, one more for the crowd, and Adam kind of has a little bit of hesitation on that front, for which I suppose is a good thing. But at the same token, you don't ever feel like there's any conflict that arrives because of this. Everybody's always, cool with it, or they'll talk about it later, things like that. And it just doesn't really work for me. I mean, one of the biggest problems I thought I had with this series was that there really weren't any strong antagonists. I mean, there were usually people that would get in the way, but there was no characters that really had a name that I could put a face to that really provided any significant amount of plot development. They run into a lot of faceless armies that have countless NPCs. Nebula Ganon, Lakanoda, Lith Day Navy. And all of these characters, aside from having maybe 1 or 2 characters that serve as the face, they don't even really get in the way too much. I mean, most of the time they kind of make the characters do what they want them to do against their will, or whatever the story of the book happens to be. And it just kind of bothers me because they never go directly against the heroes, and they usually end up, the heroes usually end up trying to find a way to free themselves from the control. And, they'll start fighting, like, however many soldiers these guys happen to have. And, of course, Adam will always make his way through any number of soldiers that you send after him, whether it's 30, 40, 50, 1,000. It doesn't seem to make a difference. And once the ship gets in a position where the plot requires it, all of a sudden, this small prototype alien ship that, was initially concerned about fighting off this enemy fleet, they have no problem doing it later in the book. And, handily defeat them without any problem. So it's like, why didn't you just do that earlier? Some of the plot points in this book, series, they're delivered by almost what I would call serendipity. I mean, the ship's computer is kind of implied to have some sort of a personality or an AI or something in its system. And, half the time when it comes up with something, it kind of feels like it's setting up a future plot point, but I don't know. It's kind of like, to me, it reminds me of when characters get spontaneous visions from the future. Sure, your future self is, maybe your future self is telling you something, but, people that deliver plot points through dreams or through future visions, it points to a weak story to me, and that's kind of what I feel in a lot of ways that this series is. So, they find their next target for book 4 just because the ship decides to show it to them, but there's really no proof, at least at this point, that the ship has an AI, although it's strongly implied, and it just kind of feels like, I don't know, it feels like they should have found this information with a little more work. I guess maybe it feels like it came too easy, so it didn't really feel like it was an earned plot point. And I guess that's the same problem I have with Visions from the Future. It's like, you just spontaneously, psychically get the information. I mean, I suppose it could have been made sense if it was worked into the plot that this was a structure. but there's no character that has the ability to see the future. I mean, Eve can read minds, but if she can't see the future, maybe if she could have, or if that was one of her defined abilities, it might have made more sense. But it just didn't to me. You know, and I mean, it also kind of just drove me crazy a little bit that, as far as the main cast went, there really wasn't any conflict among the group. It's like there was never any reason why they would split off, why one would do something when the others wouldn't want them to. They always just kind of agreed on everything, and of course that's always boring. And all of this stuff just kind of added together to just when I found out that there was like 11 total books in the series, it just kind of made me think, do I really want to stay with these characters for another 5 books? And the answer was definitely no. I mean, I'm not gonna, I know I complained a lot about it over the last 10, 15 minutes or so, but I mean, the first book was worth a read. I mean, it was fairly enjoyable, but as far as an overall series, it really just makes me wonder, how this series expected to survive, or just how it keeps putting out more installments when there really just doesn't seem to be enough happening in each book to make it worthwhile, at least for me. So, I mean, if you're looking for a sci-fi space adventure or something, I mean, maybe check out the first one, but take it one book at a time, because it really just felt to me like the series as a whole just really wasn't as impressive as I had hoped it was going to be. I'm Lauren Rivers, and this is my review of Star Justice. Thanks for watching, and if you liked it, click the subscribe button and leave a comment below. You can also find me on Twitter and a few other places on the web, or support me via Patreon or Ko-fi. Zebra hugs!